1945, Okinawa. Rain hammers the corrugated roof. Mud clings to boots like wet clay. Inside the aid tent, the air tastes of iodine and smoke, canvas walls trembling with distant artillery. A faded Red Cross armband bites into the crease of her elbow, fabric stiff with dried blood. Her hands are steady, fingers stained with antiseptic, holding an ampule slender as a promise. A stretcher creaks, a thin face, bandaged, chest rising with a rattle. Someone whispers behind her, voice raw with fatigue. He's the enemy. He's a patient. We can't waste the plasma. We can't let him die. Her thumb hovers over the glass ampule. The rain reads like a clock. She leans forward, the needle glinting. The patient's fingers close around a gelatin-glossed photograph at his chest, tape peeling at the corner, a small child's grin. A young seaman sobs quietly by a stacked pile of stretchers. The surgeon's shadow crosses the doorway. Ruth's gloved hand tightens. She lifts the needle, breath held, when the tent flap slams open. Mercy, where hate was expected. In a rain-lashed aid tent on Okinawa, Lieutenant Ruth Miller held the last ampule of plasma over a captured enemy soldier, and for a breath, the war narrowed to a single human chest. She chose the oath, the nurse's promise to treat any patient first, over whispered orders and the arithmetic of triage, risking scarce morphine, bandages, and the anger of her own command. The choice that saved a dying man would read like treason to some. If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. Lieutenant Ruth Miller served at a Navy aid station pushed close to the front on Okinawa in May 1945, a cramped field hospital of canvas and corrugated metal under constant shelling. The unit was a handful of corpsmen, one surgeon, Lieutenant Edward Collins, and a rotating team of Navy nurses who worked 12-hour shifts by dim lantern light. Stretchers were stacked in the mud outside. The Red Cross marked their armbands but did not stop the smoke. Supplies dwindled, plasma in 2 ampules, a few doses of morphine, thin rolls of bandage, no spare stretchers, and every choice could cost a life. Triage happened at the flap, a quick assessment to rank who could be helped with what was left. The Geneva Convention demanded care for wounded and prisoners alike, a rule that felt distant on a battlefield where anger and fear ran hotter than protocol. Ruth had learned her oath in a classroom, then in dressings and sutures under fire. Treat the patient before the uniform. In that rain-stiff tent, the theory met its hardest test. Oath over orders. Mercy over propaganda. The patrol arrives with the night, boots slapping through the mud like a second drumbeat. A corpsman hauls a stretcher, wet webbing squeaking. A young seaman clutches his side, blood seeping through a faded jacket. Behind him, folding across the canvas, a thin bundled figure in tattered uniform, Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka, chest dressings dark, breath a shallow whisper. Ruth kneels, fingers quick and methodical as she peels back a damp bandage to expose ragged fabric and a small entry wound. Her eyes move down the line. An American with a shattered femur who will need evacuation, a face pale and stable, the prisoner with a punctured lung fighting for a steady draw. Status? Both critical. Which one first? She measures pulse, count of respirations, the way eyelids flutter. Collins stands at the edge of the cot, jaw tight, map of fatigue around his eyes. The tent hums with other men, distant orders, a child's photo taped to a chest, the metallic scent of morphine ampules chilled by the rain. Ruth hears the arithmetic of shortage. 2 ampules left, 1 stretcher's worth of evacuation, 1 surgeon. She thinks in seconds and ounces. She sees the Italian phrase from training, time is blood, and acts. We stabilize him now, she says, voice steady. The prisoner's chest wound will kill faster. He's not our man, Collins replies, hesitant. If we waste the plasma... He's a patient, she cuts in. I won't watch him drown. Her hand moves to the ampule, the Red Cross armband against her sleeve catching a sliver of light. The surgeon exhales and nods, the room bending to the logic of the body rather than the logic of the uniform. In the quiet after, someone mutters bitterly about loyalty, another seaman simply prays. Mercy here is a clinical decision wrapped in punishment. The oath guides the hands, the tent holds its breath. They push him into the small operating space, a cleared corner under a hanging lantern, where Collins scrubbed and Ruth passed instruments with practiced calm. The chest wound required a tube. The field procedure was crude but necessary, an improvised thoracostomy to relieve the tension in the lung. Collins moves with the hard economy of a man who has stitched marrow back together too many nights. Ruth holds the light, the lens of blood and skin reflected in her pupil. Ready? Clamp. Now. The tube hissed as trapped air escaped. The prisoner coughed, a small, ragged sound like a match struck in wet paper. Ruth's fingers pressed poultice and bandage. Collins tied off bleeding vessels with knots that would soon ache his hands. They gave him a measured dose of morphine, enough to dull the edge, not enough to sedate, watching the chest rise more evenly. Across the tent, a shelled radio sputtered updates, and an exhausted corpsman checked the other patient's splint. The procedure saved minutes and a pulse. In those minutes, the tent translated medical priority into moral hazard. The bandage was a thin argument, the ampule a tiny vote for humanity. The oath did its quiet work under the roar of cannon. By dawn, murmurs had a shape. Word traveled faster than the stretcher-bearers. Someone had used scarce plasma on a prisoner. A knot of sailors gathered near the supply pallet, faces set like stone. A petty officer shoved open the flap and demanded an account. "You gave it to a Jap before one of ours," he barked, eyes bright with a thing like betrayal. A seaman who had almost lost a leg stared at Ruth with the blank face of a man who calculates in lives saved versus lives risked. "You can't just—" He was dying. He's the enemy. "He was a patient," Ruth said quietly, folding bandages with the same calm as a prayer. The complaint climbed the chain. An officer scribbled a report, and the word treason, whispered like a contagion, struck the tents. Ruth felt the weight of paper before she saw it, a formality that might become a tribunal. The Geneva Convention's name echoed in the back of her head, not as law, but as a moral reference in a room that preferred rifle answers. Saving a life here meant risking censure. The oath was a thin, visible line between duty and damnation. Late that afternoon, an officer from battalion staff arrived, his coat still beaded with rain, clipboard clutched like a weapon. He paced the canvas, the soles of his boots leaving prints in dried mud, and asked for a full recounting of the night. Collins listened, brow furrowed, while Ruth explained the clinical decisions, measured and steady. The officer's lips tightened when Ruth mentioned the photo taped to the prisoner's chest and the measured loss of plasma. "You knew people would see this badly," he said. "You knew the risks to morale." "My risk is to the patient," Ruth replied. "The oath is to the human entrusted to my care, regardless of uniform." The officer's pen hovered. He cited regulations, hinted at possible disciplinary review. Around them, the tense rhythm held. Some men still laughed, other faces had gone colder. Accusation took on the tone of a legal instrument, clipped and official. Ruth felt it wrap like a bandage that would not heal. The choice to treat had become a test of allegiance as much as a medical act. Mercy had consequences beyond the bedside. That night, tempers frayed. A group of enlisted men crowded near the prisoner's cot, eyes hard, hands on rifle stocks. The prisoner slept with one hand curled over the photograph of a woman and child. A young seaman who had been given a blood transfusion earlier limped over, anger curdling his features. "She should be court-martialed," he spat. "She gave what we needed to the enemy." Ruth stepped between them and the stretcher without ceremony, palms open, sleeves rolled. "He's not a flag to be torn down. she said softly. "He's a man who will breathe again if we let him." A corporal grunted, but did not move to push past her. The prisoner's chest rose in shallow, regular waves. The lamp cast his shadow long across the canvas. "Keep away from him," a burly seaman warned, voice thick. "Or what?" another dared. Ruth's face was steady as the needles she held. In that small, taut space, she became not just a nurse, but a living boundary. She refused to let violence reclaim the patient. For a moment, the tent felt like the place where civilization and chaos negotiated terms. Hands that had loaded shells withdrew. The oath protected a breathing man from a swarm of hatred. Rumors of court-martial grew louder the next morning. An inspector from the ship's command arrived with a stack of forms and questions that landed like small shells. "Explain why you prioritized that prisoner," he demanded. His tone suggested the experiment had failed at an ideological level. Collins stood with Ruth. His surgical hands were scarred with nights of decisions. He answered with terse medical facts. Blood pressure, respiratory effort, evacuation windows, calculations that felt naked in the face of accusation. "You're defending her medical judgment," the inspector said. "Against public sentiment." "She followed triage," Collins replied. He had the more immediate threat to life. The inspector looked from the surgeon to the nurse, as if weighing which of them would break. Rumor had already altered the plating of the ship. Sailors muttered that saving an enemy was unpatriotic. A petty officer crossed the quarterdeck with a scowl. A form was filed but then returned with a note, "Investigation pending." The wheels of command shifted slower than the pulse of a dying man. Ruth sat at a small table, waiting for the consequence, fingers cleaning instruments with an obsessive quiet. In the lull between interrogations, Ruth found herself at the makeshift sink, scrubbing the ampule tray until the metal gleamed. She thought of the photograph taped to the prisoner's chest and the child's grin. She thought of the oath, those few words that once sounded like a promise on white paper, and now felt like a living thing pressed against her skin. The tent continued to flex and breathe under shelling and rain. Every man there had a name and a history that none of them could forget. Saving one life had become a ledger entry, in a ledger that some wanted to balance with accusation rather than gratitude. The moral cost of Mercy began to tax more than supplies. She visits him between shifts when the rain has softened to a steady mist, and the rest of the tent slumps into an exhausted hush. The prisoner's eyes are sunken but clearer. His hand still clutches the photograph. Ruth lifts the curtain of hair from his brow and places a cool compress on his temple. He stirs and tries to speak. A rasp of Japanese, 2 words of English, a name that makes her inhale. "Tanaka," she murmurs, fingers steady on the bandage. "Family," he says, voice thin. He presses the photograph into her palm and points. Ruth nods, thumb brushing the little child's grin. She arranges the blanket, smooths the sheet, checks the IV drip, small gestures that read like translation. A corpsman brushes past, head down. "You understand him?" the corpsman asks. "Enough," Ruth replies. "He is in pain." For a long moment, the tent is just breath and the hum of the lantern. The prisoner's chest moves with less effort. His fingers loosen on the photograph. Ruth sits and counts the respirations, watches the slow return of warmth to the fingertips. The distance between enemy soldier and patient narrows to a series of measured interventions. Hands that were trained to kill now measure pulse and temperature. The oath works by touch. Mercy here is the catalog of small, precise acts. When a supply boat finally makes it to the shore, the relief is immediate and fragile. A crate of bandages is handed down into the mud, and with it a single pack of transfusion tubing, an unlikely miracle. The nurses move like a choreography long rehearsed. Untie knots, check seals, label blood types. Collins calls for a donor. There is worry in the tent, only certain men will match, and donating is dangerous when supplies are thin. A quiet hand lifts. "I'll give says Seaman First Class Joe Ramirez, whose name Ruth learned the week before, who had been brash and joke-prone and had nearly lost a leg. He sits on the edge of a cot and accepts the needle with a look like a soldier facing drill. "You sure?" Collins asks, sterile gloves tight. "For him," Joe says, jaw set. "We're not barbarians." 2 units of blood are drawn, labeled, and warmed. Ruth watches the transfusion start into the prisoner's arm. She watches Joe as if measuring his courage against his pulse. The prisoner's face relaxes. His fingers unfurl from the photograph. Nearby, a young sailor, who had accused her earlier, stands with his head bowed. A silence that is not forgiveness, but recognition. The gift of blood costs Joe nothing in rhetoric, but everything in potential future strength. Mercy exacts a price beyond regulation. The paperwork follows the practicality. Formal statements are written in cramped hands. Timelines, ampule counts, who's scrubbed in, who authorized the tubing. The battalion officer asks pointed questions about chain of command and whether senior approval was sought for the transfusion. Collins signs his name with a firmness that reads like support. "You made the call," he tells Ruth later when the tent has quieted and the rain taps a softer beat. "I stand by that call." "If I'd hesitated," she starts. "You didn't," he says. "You acted on what your training says." His words matter in a way that regulations do not. A surgeon's defense carries weight among those who speak in sutures and clamps. Still, the complaint is not simple paper. It becomes a rumor that travels to higher decks, drunk on indignation and righteous anger. The line between protected medical judgment and perceived betrayal is paper-thin. The tent knows both outcomes could leave scars. A formal inquiry convenes in a canvas office, folding chairs set like austere pews. The inquiry officer asks direct questions, the kind that make blood run cold. Did you consider the morale impact? Were you aware of regulations regarding prisoners? Did you act with partiality? Ruth answers with the quiet clarity of someone trained to speak about vitals. Times, amounts, the observation that the prisoner was nearer to death. Collins recounts the thoracostomy with clinical accuracy. Joe and the recovered seaman offer their short testimonies, simple facts wrapped in gratitude. "You risked everything," one of the men says suddenly, voice raw. "For a man who might have killed our friends." "We risked morale," another counters, younger and uncertain. "We can't have soldiers thinking we're soft." Ruth listens to these fragments like a doctor taking a history. She does not make a spectacle of righteousness. Instead, she places a sterile pad over the paper and signs where required. The inquiry pauses, deliberates, then sends a recommendation up the chain. In the interim, social pressure simmers. Mess tables echo with the accusation. Someone leaves an anonymous note pinned to the tent flap. "Traitor." Ruth reads it and folds it into the pocket of her scrub top, as if it were another bandage to be applied and later removed. Late one evening, the American patient with the shattered femur, who had been stable through Ruth's initial decision, returns from a stretcher evacuation to the ship, walking with a pronounced limp but alive. He seeks Ruth out in the field hospital with a quiet apology in his eyes. "You saved him," he says, voice thick. "You saved Tanaka." "He was closer to dying," she replies simply, adjusting his leg brace. "You took a risk," he says, looking down. "You could have let him die. Thank you." His words are not meant to be public defense, but private reconciliation. A nurse nearby hears, and an older seaman shrugs. Small acts of gratitude settle like dust. Not enough to erase suspicion, but enough to remind the tent of why they dressed wounds in the first place. The ledger of accusation and thanks is complex. Ruth watches both entries balance in real time. Pressure mounts beyond the field hospital. The battalion commander visits and his questions sharpen. Could her action have endangered operations? Could saving an enemy have leaked strategic information? Ruth meets his gaze and answers with the same plain speech she uses with patience. "My decision was clinical," she says. It was to preserve a life that would not have lasted the night. And the morale? He asks. The morale was a risk, she concedes. But the oath is a duty. The commander notes her words and makes his own calculations. The report travels up the chain, and whispers of court-martial grow teeth. Ruth sleeps in short bursts. She dreams in suture lines and the small face in the photograph. Every time the name Treason appears on a notepad, it warps the air a little. Yet the prisoner's recovery continues, fragile and slow. He learns enough English to say, "Thank you," haltingly. He points to his throat and mimics the sound of a breathing tube, and Ruth answers with a nod that is both medical and human. On a rain-slick morning, a battalion officer calls Ruth into a dim tent that smells of coffee and wet canvas. A captain sits with a stack of documents. The tone is formal. "We must consider whether patient first is feasible under combat conditions," he says. "You placed medical oath above unit concerns." Ruth places her hands on her knees and speaks as she would when delivering bad news. Direct, economical. "The oath is not a suggestion," she says. "In my care, a man is a patient first. If I do otherwise, I betray the very purpose of this work." Her statement is both an act of defiance and a restatement of training. The captain leans back, pen tapping. He recognizes the dissonance, the need for cohesive morale, and the separate legal and ethical obligations of medical staff. His face is not unkind, it is tired. "We will forward recommendations," he says. "Expect notice." The notice arrives, a preliminary hearing date, a formal readout. The tent tightens like a muscle preparing for a blow. Some bring flowers and small tokens of support, tight knots of ribbon from sutures, a chewed pencil, simple things to mark solidarity. Others avoid looking at Ruth in passing. The prisoner, now able to sit up with support, watches from his cot and offers a nod that is both gratitude and an acknowledgement of danger. During the hearing, testimony proceeds with clinical and human details. Collins's voice is steady, willing. He answers direct questions about protocol with the blunt facts of anatomy and timing, the prisoner's respiratory compromise, the immediate danger, the decision for thoracostomy, the transfusion need. Joe testifies about volunteering blood. The recovered American gives a short, measured statement about the sequence of events. The inquiry asks whether Ruth considered the optics. She answers, "Yes," and then explains the clinical imperative. "You knew this could be viewed as treasonous," the presiding officer says with a gravity meant to reduce any moralizing to procedure. "I knew," Ruth replies. "I also knew what would happen if I did nothing." The hearing is not a dramatic tribunal, but a bureaucratic grind with human stakes. Witnesses are polite and honest, some voices tremble. The presiding officer weighs testimony, the notation of ampule counts, and the evidence of donations. He considers the Geneva Convention in abstract, an absent but present standard, and the regulations. In the end, he issues a finding that is itself a compromise. No court-martial, but a reprimand on record and a formal caution about future orders. It is neither vindication nor full punishment. The paper lands like a bandage. Temporary relief, then a scar. Ruth accepts the reprimand with a measured nod. Collins unscrews the cap of a glass bottle and pours coffee into 2 metal cups, handing one to her without a word. The tent exhales. Some sailors cheer quietly. Others feel cheated. The prisoner is transferred. No triumphant parade. Just a lit cart and a medic with a clipboard. He waves, small and uncertain, at the tent that had become a strange, safe place. The rumor of treason does not vanish. At mess and at watch, sailors trade versions of the event that place their own fears and hopes into the narrative. Some call Ruth a traitor in private and then catch themselves when the image of a child's photograph intrudes. Others repeat the surgeon's clinical logic and slowly a new story circulates. Not treason, but the difficult work of applying an oath when the world expects a different kind of measure. In the months that follow, small acts alter the tenor of judgment. The American who had been spun back aboard the ship returns to send a short letter to the aid tent, a line of appreciation and a folded photograph of his own family. Joe, who gave his blood, receives quiet commendation from a petty officer. Collins writes to his superiors, noting the clinical appropriateness of Ruth's decision. The reprimand remains in her record, a bureaucratic scar, but the immediate danger of prosecution recedes. Ruth continues to work, hands steady, treating whomever is brought through the flap. The armband on her elbow frays further. A rust-colored stain marks one edge where blood dried in a pattern that looks almost like a map. She tends to sailors who will carry their limps for the rest of their lives, and to prisoners who will be moved through processes neither she nor they control. Sometimes a man she treated inches past her and offers a silent nod. Sometimes they spit and look away. The tent learns to live with the tension between mercy and suspicion. Once, months later, a letter arrives from a small field hospital where the prisoner had been sent after evacuation. A translator had helped him write. The letter is short, awkward with gratitude, and a child's drawing taped inside. Ruth reads it under lamplight, thumb tracing the crude lines. The letter says simply, "You kept my father alive." She places the drawing in her pocket. It is a private confirmation that the oath had consequences, both painful and enduring. The tent, like a hand after heavy work, bears calluses and stained creases. Men remember the night in different ways, as a stain of betrayal, as an example of difficult compassion, as a test of their own limits. Ruth continues to work with the same quiet discipline. She does not trumpet her actions. She stitches, counts, measures, and moves on to the next urgent thing. But in small acts, the way she smooths a blanket, the precise knot she ties on a drain, her oath lives out its simple, stubborn form. The story of a single ampule and a photograph travels beyond the tent, into the logbooks and into private letters, into whispers at the mess and into the careful signatures on official papers. It becomes a quiet case study of the cost of mercy under fire, a nurse risking career and reputation to preserve a life that others deemed expendable. The field hospital continued to treat both friend and enemy, and each decision left marks not only on uniforms, but on the conscience of those who had to choose. In those days, in a rain-slick place far from home, the tent had been a small theater where the oath was tested against propaganda and expediency. Ruth's choice did not end the war or change strategy, but it altered in a slow, human way what the men in that tent and who heard about it would consider possible. The act of saving a dying man, regardless of his uniform, became a lesson in restraint, in choosing to be civilian amid chaos. Months later, Ruth sits by a dim lantern, the Red Cross armband frayed and stained folded on her knee, an empty ampule like a spent promise beside a stack of ration cards. The reprimand is in a file. A child's drawing slips from her pocket. Men remember the night with different words, shame, thanks, or silence, but the quiet fact remains. Strength is restraint. Civilization is a choice. If this account moved you, subscribe to the channel and explore more true stories of medicine and mercy under fire.